So good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be part of this opportunity to provide this webinar to you today. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Susan Schmidt. I'm an Assistant Superintendent of Student Services in Pembina Trails School Division. But to get to know you a little bit, I'm going to put on a very quick poll. So you can see, even though this is private, I'd just like to know a little bit about you for future planning, what kinds of topics you might be interested in the future, so you can click on those. Team conversations, coaching conversations, delegating, generations, you might work with different generations of people, and accountability. And how many years have you served as a school trustee? Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you very much. So here we go. So I've been interested in learning about improving communication for a really long time. Here we go. Now you get a picture of me. It's led me to studying cognitive coaching. I'm part of the IPEC coaching. I'm a life coach. That IPEC is the Institute for Professional Excellence in Coaching. And I've been trained in the Train the Trainer model in Fierce Conversations, which I was lucky enough to go to New York for. So today is an introduction to Fierce Conversations. It's part of a two-part series. The second part will focus on some conversation strategies. So welcome. Also, just one other piece. On your screen, right at the bottom, you'll see that there will be a point where you could ask some questions or put your hand up if you've got some things you're interested in. So I'll watch for those too as we go along. When you think of the word conversation, it comes from the Latin word converse, which means to associate with. It's an exchange of ideas and sentiments. It begins with three letters, C-O-N. In Spanish, con means with. With is an integral part of Fierce Conversations. We invite people into conversations by saying we would like to talk with you, not to you. Sometimes you may have had the experience where you've had a versation instead of a conversation. As I mentioned, as we go through the webinar, I may ask you to have some questions, and you can put those down in that little part at the bottom of the box and I can see them. How many of you can think of a time where you've had a versation instead of a conversation? What is the problem with a versation? Got any thoughts on that? You can add your pieces and I can see them. Conversations are the workplace, the workhorses of an organization. They are the work of a leader. As trustees, your role is to represent the beliefs and values of a community. That's a big responsibility. To understand those foundations of a community, you need to live and breathe what happens and talk with people. As it states in your document, public schools belong to everyone through MSBA. Everyone has a stake in the success of public schools. And when schools are strong and students succeed, we all benefit. I'm going to move to the next slide. So one of my favorite quotes in the Fierce Conversation model is, while no single conversation is guaranteed to change the trajectory of a career, a company, or a relationship or a life, any single conversation can. What about a fierce conversation? When you hear those words, what are some of the assumptions you think about what a fierce conversation is? You can type those in if you've got some thoughts on that. Fierce conversations sounds pretty powerful. If you can imagine the most positive definition of a fierce conversation, what words come to mind? Think of fierce loyalty, when somebody is fiercely loyal to an organization or a person. Michael Fullen, who is a great lead educational researcher in Canada, states that the single most common factor to successful changes in schools or school divisions or in communities is that relationships improve. If relationships improve, schools get better. If relationships remain the same or get worse, ground is lost. As trustees, you have a delicate balance of listening and conversing with community and keeping those strong relationships with each other as a board and your senior admin team and schools and community members. That's a big, big piece of responsibility. Fierce Conversations identifies that conversations are the most powerful tool. In this quote, and I'm going to repeat it because I think it's a very important foundational quote to review. While no single conversation is guaranteed to change the trajectory of a career, a company, or a relationship, or a life, any single conversation can. So as trustees, at some point, you might have had a conversation, a short conversation, or a long conversation, and somebody might have seen something in you that you might have not even seen in yourself. For example, they might have said to you, have you thought about running for parent council? Have you thought about getting involved in your local school? Have you thought about being a chair of a committee? Or this September, are you thinking about running for election? So those conversations are critical to think about what steps you do next. And I know you'd all be thinking about that. The Kaleidoscope is one of the favorite tools and toys that young children have because they love the magic when they move that kaleidoscope to one place and to another. So this was actually a Christmas card from Fierce Conversations. It only takes one shift. And we know that when we move that kaleidoscope slightly, we see something else, and then we see something else again. So to think about a conversation, we sometimes want to change the whole picture to take on a positive conversation. A fierce conversation, to help you think a little bit further in the definition of what it means, is powerful, passionate, honest, and intense. But it's not about handing your head on a platter. There are no claws, and there is no blood on the ground. So I got used to starting with that shift in that kaleidoscope to think about what is a fierce conversation. So the simplest definition of it is a fierce conversation is a conversation in which you come out from behind ourselves into the conversation and make it real. Well, some people are afraid of real. It is the unreal conversations that ought to concern us because they are incredibly expensive, both for an organization and for the individual. You know when you're having a fierce conversation, you're speaking in your own voice. You're speaking to the heart of the matter, and you are really asking and really listening. You're generating heat, you're enriching a relationship, and you are different when the conversation is over. Why would it be more important to have a fierce conversation in your role? How would it benefit you? What would change if you brought more of yourself into the conversation? What keeps you from being real in every conversation? As you think about those questions, I want you to pause and think about, are there times when you don't feel, you walked away and wondered, that wasn't real, that wasn't who I wanted to be? And what can you do about that? How can you come out from behind yourself into the conversation and make it real? The next component of Fierce foundational work I'm going to talk about is leadership. And we're going to look at two different leadership models, an old leadership model and a new leadership model. And this again is very foundational in the work in fierce conversations. So if you look at the first column, directing and telling, what was that old leadership model? It probably exists some places still. Feedback-free, development-free zone, little if any personal growth. There was delegating, abdicating, holding people accountable. High task, low relationship, and the culture of compliance that goes with it. Silos and fiefdoms competing for resources, not good at partnering. One of the things, just a little sidebar, you notice in Susan Scott's work, the founder of Fierce Conversations, is she's quite a literary expert. So when you read her book, she has all kinds of interesting English words in it, like fiefdoms. The other component I want you to draw your eyes towards is a new leadership model. That model, which is a foundational component of Fierce, is really asking, really listening, then directing. It's feedback rich, it's a development rich zone, and there's ongoing personal growth. What else do you want to think about? Delegating, coaching, holding people able, and modeling accountability. We're all accountable together. There's high task and high relationship and the culture of passionate engagement that goes with that new leadership model. And there's a sharing resources, collaborating, and partnering across functions and service of the organizational goals. As I said at the very beginning of the introduction to this concept, leadership has changed. And when you look through each one of these concepts, think about the strengths of your organization, where you are in your life right now, and examine where you believe you can grow. Where are you as an individual? What are you the most proud of? The old familiar type of leadership no longer works. What do you know about your organization and your leadership? Now this chart just continues just a little bit more. So we're going to look at one more slide in this. And I'm going to draw your attention again to the old leadership model. We were talking about really asking, really listening, and directing. In that old leadership model, it was information starved. It was on a need-to-know culture. It was business as usual, no innovation in that old leadership model. And there was the impose your view of reality and the issue. That meant that you weren't really listening. In the new leadership model, we're looking at open, transparent, respectful culture, original thinking, going further, taking risks, and innovating. And you're exposing your view of reality and issues. So change over time occurs in leadership models. And that's what I'd like you to think about and reflect upon is, where are you in your leadership? Who are you in your leadership? And where do you want to be? Because we want to think about authenticity. We want to think about content with import, and fierce conversation is not what you want to do for dinner or the movie you want to see. We want to think about fierce conversations as something with a topic with substance. As trustees, you have lots of them. Each winter, I know because I join you in our school division, talk about the process of budget. How collectively do you stay on as leaders to what stays and what goes? What are the best research programming for students? How do policies get developed? And how do you deal with the public? In leadership, you need to think about where that sits as you develop as trustees. There are 4 objectives in Fierce Conversations, and we're going to move to those 4 objectives now for you to do some thinking about it. Now, you might know that conversations can be fiercely deadly. My goodness, there it's not going to slide on. There it is. Ha! Sometimes they can be a profound experience of humanity. They can be a profound experience of intimacy. But we're going to look at these 4 components of the objectives of a fierce conversation. Interrogate reality is first. What does that mean? Why would you want to do that? Reality is constantly changing. If I looked out into the window today and looked out into Provence, the reality would change every second a vehicle went by. But what might be your reality is going to be different than mine. And we know that we need to check into what is that present reality. If I asked all of you to think about what you're seeing right now, where you are, and describe what you see, I bet we wouldn't all see the same thing. This is what gets us into trouble sometimes. I know it gets me into trouble sometimes because what I see is different than what others see. So we describe what we think is right, and what we really need to do when we're interrogating reality is we need to get curious. So what's the second component, the second objective of fierce conversations? It's to provoke learning. This is not just your learning, it's the other person's learning too. This is the sharing that you help look at what your perspective and the other person's perspective is and find out what it's all about. Because together, in the conversation, you are both learning. This is sometimes the hardest objective, the third objective. Tackle tough challenges. Fierce conversations are not neutral. They're not about taking it easy or practicing for a while what you want to do. I've lost that thought. Just a minute. I'm going to come back and reread that again. They are not about taking it easy and practicing for a while. You need to start building your conversation muscles. If you tackle tough challenges, you'll travel lighter. Sometimes you free up energy to take care of things that really matter. You might even think about, I don't know if you want to practice it at home right away, but I bet sometimes there's things that you'd like to tackle at home. And once you tackle those things, it does make you breathe easier because you feel better about it. There's one more objective in a fierce conversation today that I'd like you to look at, and that's to enrich relationships. If you've only done the first three objectives in a conversation, then you haven't enriched relationships. It's often the one that gets forgotten or overlooked, and this is where respect lies. It's possible to have the three other objectives present in a conversation and still leave each other devastated. Fierce conversation enriches relationships. This is something within us that responds deeply to those who level with us. What would people say about you? Have you enriched relationships with people? Okay, I'm going to move to 3 transformational ideas. There's lots of components and theory about fierce, and that's what we're working on today. This quote, our careers, our companies, our personal relationships, and our very lives succeed or fail, gradually, then suddenly, one conversation at a time. These transformational ideas are like base camp. We're setting things up for the future. And as we go through them today, I'd like you to think about how conversations are built. When we have our second webinar, you'll see that the model that you will learn has these ideas embedded into the conversation tool that you'll learn. This idea was actually inspired by Ernest Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises, a play that he wrote. There's a character who asks, how did you go bankrupt? And the answer from this character in Ernest Hemingway's work was, it was gradually and then suddenly. When do we see this in schools? There's times that we need to hold tighter to students. We think they're doing fine. And then in education, one of our biggest losses is when students drop out. Was that because there was a missing conversation that might have caused some of those issues? Or was there a failed conversation? In this component of the training, one of the challenges that I'd like you to begin thinking about is, do you track your conversations? You might keep a journal where you put information about tracking those important conversations you have and review them and ask yourself, how did they go? Research states that highly effective individuals track conversations. When we think about in life where we've seen gradually then suddenly, it could be in the economy, it could be in a divorce, it could be in a friendship. I want you, as you're thinking about this idea, to think about examples that might have happened in your life, ones where you thought things were successful, and then gradually, suddenly, something changed. So I'm going to talk about something, and we're going to move. We're going to move from where Susan Scott did her work to we're going to move to Papua New Guinea. You didn't know you were going to go there today. And we're going to talk about something called a Mokita. It's not a drink, because you might think that's what it is. A Mokita is a situation in which everyone knows about something and no one speaks about it. Sometimes we call it the elephant in the room. The Papuans of New Guinea judge the health of any community by the number of Mokitas that exist within it. The Mokita affects the health of an organization. In my experience, when we've talked about Mokitas, we're more focused and driven. The data we received from the province not long ago on how our students were doing, it was disaggregated and we received it all. It was like a splash of cold water. Certainly our experience in our school division was we learned that many of our Indigenous students were not doing very well. That's driven us to be much more focused. Another issue that we experienced in our school division is we had students in high school that weren't doing as well. And some of them had 1 foot in or 1 foot out or completely out of the picture completely. And we weren't graduating them. We're really proud of the alternative high school we created, and we will have a number of graduates walking across the stage in a successful fashion this year. So think about, what are the Mokitas in your organization? What are the Mokitas in your personal life? As I was thinking and preparing for this, I was thinking about the great work we've done in Canada around mental health, and when we have the Bell Talk About It Day, and how brave people have been to lean in, talk about issues of mental health, because we didn't talk about it before. And in many ways, it has been an elephant in the room or an elephant in our society. So I want you to think about Mokita. If you were here and we were doing a workshop in person, I would have an exercise for you to do where you would identify Mokita and think about what that's costing you in your life. You might do that right now. Find that Mokita. Janice is really helpful to point out if I've forgotten something. Thank you, Janice. So the second transformational idea is the conversation is the relationship. And you see that word is italicized. So there's a story to illustrate this from David White, a poet. David suggests that in a typical marriage, the newly married man is often frustrated that this person who he intends to spend the rest of his life with seemingly wants to talk and talk about the same thing they talked about last weekend. This is according to David White. That might sound familiar to us. He asked, why couldn't we just have one big conversation and then coast for a year or two? David White writes about this in his poetry. The answer is not. This ongoing, robust conversation he's having with his wife is not about the relationship. The conversation is the relationship. If you think about an equation, C equals R. We invest not in money. The capital in the relationship is the emotional capital. In 2002, David Kahneman, the author of Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, won the Nobel Prize for Economics when he proved that human beings make decisions first for emotional reasons, second for rational reasons. It is the human conditions. And we sure know that when we're raising our children, that we always make those decisions around our children, around emotion. And then we try and bring a little bit of rational around that. So I want you to really think about that. It's a really important component of the second transformational idea. The conversation is the relationship. The third transformational idea is all conversations are with myself, and sometimes they involve other people. So I'd like to see if I can get any interaction from any of you, and let me know how many of you have left a meeting and discovering at some point that apparently we were all at the same meeting. Maybe you've driven away and you wondered about it, or you've left the conversation only to realize that what you heard and what the other person heard, they're not the same thing. We each put our own spin on the conversation. In cognitive coaching, when I studied that, one of the concepts is to practice listening. How good are we at practicing listening? Think about how you are present. Cognitive coaching talks about a concept called autobiographical listening. Maybe some of you have had this experience. One person's talking, they're telling you their deepest, darkest secrets. And in the side of your head, you're thinking about, oh yeah, that happened to me. I remember that. And you're spending so much time thinking about your own personal autobiography that you aren't being present with that person. Sometimes people get confused by the way we're not present, and some people misinterpret what we're saying and what we're doing. Emails and texts have sure created that for us. How often do we get an email and we don't follow up until we decide that we can interpret what that person has written to us? It's critical to ensure whatever your expectation is, it's understood by the whole team. The challenge for us in conversations is to abandon our fears and embrace the conversation. I want to challenge all of you to catch yourself next time you think you can't have a conversation, and be reminded that the quality of my relationships will degrade or improve one conversation at a time. It's my job to engage in conversation. I want you to begin thinking about what experience have you had where you haven't weighed into a conversation. I'm going to wait for a minute to see if I can get some of you to key in on your keyboard about a conversation that you were thinking about having. I'll wait for you. One of the components in Fierce, but we're not going to talk about this one for you to think about, is let silence do the heavy lifting. I'd like to hear from some of you. What are your thoughts about all conversations are with myself, and sometimes they involve other people? Okay, let me look at this question. How do you address people who demise what you're saying when you're speaking out openly? Great question. So just for clarification, I'm guessing that what that means is somebody has put down what you've said or made you not feel as good as you want to do, or hasn't valued what you've said. Conversation of code of conduct for trustees. So that's a really important conversation. I'm going to ask you to think about, is there times when you think about code of conduct, have you thought about it as an agreement? Have you thought about what are the most important things that we can agree upon in our conversations? It's really important for people to have some ways that they can come to, if you look at some of these kinds of works that I've just shared with you, is can you come to an agreement on all conversations are with myself, and sometimes they involve other people. One of the components I think about that is in a code of conduct is a parking lot conversation. You think you've had the whole conversation with a team, you've made some decisions, and maybe this doesn't happen to other people, but I know I've had that experience where the meeting continues to go on in the parking lot or in the bathroom or some other place, and because of that, you don't feel like you've been valued and you've had that opportunity to do that. I think it's really important to, though, when there is somebody talking about things that makes you feel uncomfortable, is identify that. I think that we really need to have a really good, fierce conversation. We need to really talk about what that means to you when somebody makes you feel uncomfortable. And using the I word, I feel uncomfortable when I hear that. I wish that we could talk about this in a different way, but I think it's important for every group. I know I did that with my team this morning. We talked about what do we picture that's really important for values for us to work collaboratively together for next year. I think it's important for us to always be revisiting that. Other questions? Other questions that people have? Okay. We are getting, actually, this is a little shorter than I thought it would be, because, and I think that'll be okay, because this is my first experience with that. But every time that I do these workshops, because this is actually what you'll see next time, is what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working on a workshop format next week, where I'm going to teach you about how to have a conversation, how to structure it, how to practice it, and I'm going to give you a tool to take away so that you can trial it in the work that you're doing. And I think it may help you with the question that you're asking, how to address people when things aren't going quite the way you hope. So what I want you to do is I want all of you to pick up a pen or a piece of paper, or there might be some of you that take notes on your telephone, and I want you to think about how you are going to abandon your fears and embrace conversations. I want to challenge all of you next time when you think you can't have a conversation, to be reminded of the quality of conversations and the relationships, and that you can improve one conversation at a time. Think about this. It is my job to engage in conversation. So here's your homework. Everybody get your pen, get your phone, get whatever way that you are going to think about what you need. I want you to write down, right now, a conversation that you've been avoiding. A conversation who you have to think about, who would that be with? What would that conversation be about? Because what I'm going to ask you to do is start a personal action plan. So the personal action plan, I'm going to give it back to you again, is write down who you've been avoiding having a conversation with. What is that conversation about? When are you going to be thinking about that personal action plan to start taking place? We'll give you a tool next week so you can practice it. But beforehand, I want you to get that. So beginning now, it's a little shorter than I thought I would be, but that's okay because this was my first experience with a webinar. And I want you to work on that homework, and then I am going to remind you that next time, part 2 of Fierce Conversations is June 12th at 11:30. You can contact Janice Arnold if you haven't received a unique link. and or check MSBA's association website for new webinars. It'll be live and recorded, www.mbschoolboards.ca. And you can click the top for services, trustee education, and e-learning. And if you want to register for a live webinar, you can contact Janice Arnold, Board Development Consultant at jarnold@mbschoolboards.ca. I hope everybody's thank you very much for this opportunity and have a great day.